She called me her guilty pleasure with a teasing smile, but the way her eyes lingered told a different story, one neither of us was ready to admit. It was a late spring afternoon when I moved into the small rental house on Willow Lane. The street was quiet, lined with maple trees just starting to sprout soft green leaves. Birds chirped lazily in the distance, and the air carried that faint sweetness of freshly watered grass. I was still unloading boxes from my car when I noticed her for the first time. Across the narrow hedge, she stood on her porch watering potted plants. Clara, though I didn't know her name yet, had that rare kind of presence that made the rest of the world fade into the background. She looked to be in her early 40s, with chestnut brown hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck and a linen shirt tucked casually into soft blue jeans. No makeup. No show. Just an ease in her posture that spoke of a woman who had lived enough life to no longer need to impress anyone. The sun slanted through the trees, catching the droplets from her hose and scattering them into tiny rainbows around her. I was halfway through lifting another box when her voice floated over, warm and amused. "Young man," she called, tilting her head slightly, "you planning to mow that lawn any time this year?" I froze for a second, caught between embarrassment and intrigue. I was getting to it," I stammered. She smiled, "Not the kind you give a stranger, but the kind that slips past your guard without warning." "Good. We have standards in this neighborhood," she teased, eyes glinting. It was a small exchange, almost nothing on the surface. But the way she looked at me, steady, unhurried, like she was quietly sizing up this new boy next door, made something flicker in my chest. I laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of my neck. She laughed too, soft and low, the sound mingling with the hiss of the water from her hose. As I carried the last box inside, I couldn't shake the image of her standing there, sunlight spilling over her shoulders, the scent of jasmine drifting through the air. She wasn't just attractive, she had a kind of presence, confident, graceful, with a touch of playfulness that caught me off guard. I told myself it was nothing. Just a friendly neighbor. But deep down, something had already shifted. I had noticed her, and she had definitely noticed me. In that quiet suburban street, between boxes and blooming flowers, an unspoken electricity had sparked, subtle, but unmistakable. And neither of us would forget it. The days after that first meeting fell into a gentle rhythm. I worked during the day, unpacked slowly at night, and every evening, as if on cue, Clara would appear in her backyard. Sometimes she'd be trimming a rose bush, sometimes sipping a glass of wine on her porch swing, her legs tucked under her casually. There was something calming about her presence, steady, warm, unhurried. One evening, as the sky bruised into shades of purple and gold, I found myself stepping out with a mug of coffee, pretending to check the fence. She noticed immediately. "Couldn't sleep," she called, raising her wine glass. I shook my head. "Just, not used to the silence yet," I admitted. She smiled knowingly. "It grows on you. Or it drives you crazy. Depends on the person." And just like that, our late-night ritual began. Night after night, we'd find ourselves leaning against the low wooden fence that separated our yards, me with my coffee, her with her wine. The cool air carried the scent of damp grass, and somewhere far off, a dog barked lazily. Porch lights cast soft halos around us, giving everything a gentle, almost cinematic glow. Clara talked the way some people read poetry, slowly, deliberately, with meaning in every pause. She told me about her daughter, Emma, who was away at a boarding school. About her love for old jazz records and how she sometimes danced alone in her kitchen when no one was watching. She even shared little fragments of her divorce, never bitterly, but like someone who had accepted the past and folded it neatly away. I listened more than I spoke. I was 24, still figuring out who I was. My stories were about uncertain jobs, half-finished dreams, and late-night thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. But she listened as if every word mattered. Her eyes held that quiet attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. Sometimes our conversations would trail into comfortable silence. I'd watch the way her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass, or how a strand of hair slipped loose and she'd tuck it behind her ear without thinking. Those small gestures stayed with me. One night, as we laughed about something trivial, our hands brushed over the fence, just for a second. Her skin was warm, and neither of us moved away immediately. The touch was accidental, but the quiet spark that followed was not. By the time I went inside, the house didn't feel as silent anymore. It felt expectant. Something between us was growing, softly, like a secret we hadn't spoken aloud yet. It was one of those breezy Saturday afternoons when the world felt unhurried. The sunlight filtered gently through the trees, and the neighborhood was wrapped in a kind of sleepy calm. Clara had asked if I'd help her repaint the old fence that separated our yards. "If you're going to live next to me," she joked, handing me a paintbrush, "you might as well contribute to the scenery." We set up side by side, dipping brushes into pale cream paint, working in a slow rhythm. She wore faded denim overalls over a white tank top, her hair tied up messily, a few strands framing her face. It wasn't glamorous, and yet, she looked effortlessly beautiful. Every time she laughed at something, a soft crinkle formed near her eyes, and it did something to me I couldn't quite explain. About an hour in, the wind picked up and a playful gust splattered paint onto my cheek. She burst out laughing, that low, warm laugh that always caught me off guard. "Hold still," she said, stepping closer. Before I could react, she reached up and gently brushed her thumb across my cheek, wiping the streak away. Her skin was warm, her touch soft but lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. For a moment, it felt like the air between us tightened, not awkwardly, but with a quiet awareness neither of us could ignore. Then, with that same teasing glint in her eyes, she leaned slightly closer and murmured, "Boys like you are my guilty pleasure." My breath hitched. The words were playful, maybe even meant as a joke, but the way she said them, low, deliberate, like a thought that had slipped out, made something inside me flutter. She held my gaze for just a second longer than she should have, then turned back to the fence as if nothing had happened. I tried to focus on painting, but my heartbeat thudded in my ears. No one had ever spoken to me like that, especially not someone like her. She was confident, self-assured, years ahead of me in experience. And yet, that moment made the space between us feel suddenly charged. The rest of the afternoon carried a new energy. She hummed softly to herself while painting. I found myself watching the way the sunlight traced her shoulders. Neither of us mentioned her words again, but they hung there, light as air, impossible to ignore. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just neighborly closeness anymore. It was something slowly, quietly shifting beneath the surface. The shift was subtle at first. Clara started closing her curtains earlier. Her porch, once softly lit every evening, now stayed dark more often. The late-night conversations over the fence that had become our quiet ritual began to fade into silence. At first, I thought she was just busy, but deep down, I felt it. Something had changed. It started with whispers. One afternoon, while picking up mail, I overheard two women from down the street talking in hushed tones by their hedges. "She's been spending a lot of time with that boy," one of them said. "Freshly divorced and already entertaining someone half her age," the other replied with a scoff. Their words weren't meant for me, but they sliced through the calm I'd built. Later that week, a friend from town stopped by. As we sat on my porch, he smirked and nodded toward Clara's house. "Man, your neighbor's hot. You hitting that?" I laughed it off, but inside, a knot tightened in my chest. Their tones turned something genuine into something cheap, something I didn't recognize. I began to wonder if she'd heard similar remarks. A few evenings later, I saw her through her kitchen window. She was sitting alone at the counter, sipping wine, her face thoughtful, almost distant. When our eyes met briefly through the glass, she gave me a polite smile, nothing more. No wave. No warmth. Just a quiet acknowledgement before she turned away. I can't explain why it stung the way it did. It wasn't like we were anything official. But the fence between our houses, once alive with laughter and conversation, now felt like a wall. I found myself stepping outside at night, mug in hand, hoping she'd appear like before. But her light stayed off. Doubt crept in slowly. Was I imagining everything between us? Maybe it had only ever been playful teasing to her. Maybe I had read too much into every glance, every touch, every soft moment that lingered a little too long. And yet, I couldn't shake the memory of her thumb on my cheek. Her words. That spark. She, too, was wrestling with her own fears. I didn't know it then, but the whispers had reached her ears. People's judgment, the weight of appearances, the fear of being misunderstood, they were pulling her back behind her walls. For the first time since I'd met her, the space between us felt cold. Not angry. Not broken. Just quietly distant, like two people standing on opposite sides of something neither was ready to name. The rain came suddenly that evening, the kind that starts as a drizzle and turns into a full downpour before you can blink. The sky was dark and heavy, the air electric with that earthy scent of wet pavement. I was standing by my window, watching the street blur beneath sheets of rain, when I saw her. Clara was struggling to unload groceries from the trunk of her car. She balanced paper bags against her hip while fumbling for her keys, her hair plastered to her forehead, clothes already soaked through. Instinct overrode hesitation. I grabbed my hoodie and ran out into the rain without a second thought. Clara. I called out over the storm. She turned, surprised, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I've got it, she insisted, clutching a bag tightly. But I was already beside her, taking 2 bags from her hands before she could argue. Together we hurried up her porch steps, laughing breathlessly as the rain pounded against the roof. Water streamed down our faces, our shoulders brushing as we squeezed through the narrow doorway. Inside, the house was warm and dim, the soft glow of kitchen lights cutting through the gloom. I set the bags on the counter, shaking water from my sleeves, when she spoke quietly. This is complicated, she said, her voice barely above the sound of the rain outside. She stood near the counter, hair damp and curling around her face, arms crossed as if to steady herself. Why? I asked gently, stepping closer but careful not to corner her. She exhaled shakily. Because people talk. Because I've already lived through a storm once, and I'm not sure I can handle another. I swallowed, my heart pounding. Clara, I don't care what people say. I like being around you. Not because you're older. Not because it's some fantasy. But because when I'm here, I hesitated, searching for the right words. It feels like someone finally understands me. For a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes softened, the walls she built beginning to crack. You have no idea how long it's been since someone made me feel seen, she whispered. A single raindrop slid down from her hairline onto her cheek. Without thinking, I brushed it away with my fingertips. Her breath caught. The kitchen fell silent except for the rain. We stood close, wet clothes clinging to our skin, the warmth between us cutting through the chill. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't anything as loud as that. But in that quiet, trembling space, we both knew. Something had shifted, irreversibly. A few days passed after that rain-soaked confession, quieter days, but not distant ones. There was a new softness in the air between us, like the pause between 2 heartbeats. Then one evening, Clara appeared at my door with a small, hesitant smile. Dinner, she said simply, holding up a grocery bag. A proper thank you for rescuing me from drowning the other night. Inside her home, everything felt warm and lived in. Soft jazz floated from a vintage speaker. The air smelled like rosemary and baked bread, with hints of garlic simmering on the stove. She moved around the kitchen gracefully, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied loosely, a few wisps escaping to frame her face. I offered to help, and she handed me a knife to chop vegetables. Cooking together felt surprisingly natural. We laughed over unevenly chopped carrots and argued lightly about how much salt to add. It wasn't flirtatious this time, it was comfortable, a rhythm that felt like it had been there all along, just waiting to be found. After dinner, we lingered by the sink, rinsing plates. The music had softened to a mellow saxophone tune. The house lights were dim, the only glow coming from candles flickering on the table. As we reached for the same dish, our hands touched beneath the warm running water. This time, neither of us moved away. She turned toward me slowly, her hands still damp. Her eyes searched mine, cautious but open. I stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of rosemary on her skin. She tilted her head slightly, a small, unsure smile tugging at her lips. Without overthinking, I reached up and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath trembled. For a second, I thought she might pull away, but instead, she leaned into my touch. Then, in the soft light of her kitchen, she closed the space between us, not with words, but by resting her forehead against my chest. Her arms wrapped around me slowly, almost as if she was giving herself permission to do it. I exhaled, my arms slipping around her waist, holding her carefully, like she was something precious. Her cheek pressed against my heartbeat, and in that quiet, everything else faded. No neighbors. No whispers. No age gap. Just two people, wrapped in warmth, finding something real in the spaces between words. It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was gentle. It was honest. And it was ours. The weeks that followed didn't feel like the beginning of a whirlwind romance. They felt like settling into something real. Clara and I didn't rush. There were no loud declarations, no dramatic scenes. Instead, there was quiet consistency, shared mornings, lingering evenings, and the kind of closeness that grows in the spaces between everyday moments. I started stopping by her place in the mornings before work. She'd already be awake, sitting on her porch with a mug of tea, wrapped in a soft knit sweater. The sun would spill over the neighborhood roofs, casting a gentle glow on her face. Sometimes we'd talk about nothing, the weather, the way the roses were blooming. Other times, we'd slip into deeper conversations about dreams, regrets, and everything in between. Her daughter, Emma, visited one weekend. I was nervous, unsure how she'd react to me being there. Clara introduced me casually, not as anything official, just as the neighbor who keeps me company. Emma was sharp, bright-eyed, and protective. But as the weekend went on, she warmed to me. We cooked dinner together one night, and she teased her mom about finally smiling more. The house filled with laughter that felt like home. The neighborhood whispers didn't disappear entirely. Some still glanced a little too long when they saw us talking on her porch or walking back from the farmer's market together. But neither of us flinched anymore. Clara had stopped dimming her light to make others comfortable. And I had stopped second-guessing what we had just because it didn't fit some expected mold. One evening, as the sky melted into shades of gold and rose, we sat together on her porch swing. She wore a light cardigan over a simple dress, her hair loose, catching the soft breeze. I sat beside her, my arm draped comfortably around her shoulders. She leaned into me with a quiet sigh, her head resting against my chest. The swing creaked gently, cicadas hummed in the background, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the air, the same scent from the day we first met. She looked up at me, her eyes warm and unguarded. "You know," she said softly, "I didn't expect this." "Me neither," I whispered. And we didn't need to say anything more. There, on that porch, not in some grand gesture, but in shared silence, we became something neither of us had planned for, but both had found unexpectedly, a quiet, steady love. A new kind of neighbor. A new kind of us.